dissociative disorders. So the majority of the PowerPoint is there's a lot of text. It's pretty explanatory, self-explanatory. The part where it starts getting confusing is the dissociative disorders. So I'm going to talk in this lecture about the dissociative disorders, and I'm going to talk about schizophrenia. I do find that students tend to be more interested in that anyway, and I think that it'll make for an interesting lecture today. So we're going to talk about the dissociative disorders. And the interesting thing here is that a lot of movies look at different disorders, dissociative disorders and different kinds of disorders. And really, sometimes it can glamorize it, and sometimes it can make it look and seem really, really weird or intriguing. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the ones that I think tend to be more popular for movies to do something with. So dissociative disorders these are this category of disorders where we're seeing really extreme, and then we also see frequent disruptions of awareness. And that's where we're seeing that the awareness, memory, and identity, if I can spell, these are major issues when you see dissociative identities or dissociative disorders. So what happens is that the dissociative process means that you're sort of dissociating from reality. You don't know where you are, you don't know who you are, you don't know what's happened. And there's a few versions of dissociative disorders that we're going to kind of talk about today. So one of them is dissociative amnesia. We have dissociative fugue. And then we have dissociative identity disorder. And this one is a little bit, we're going to spend a little bit more time in this one than the others. This one is actually one you're probably very familiar with, but you just know it by a different name. So when it comes to dissociative amnesia, what we find is that we see that people tend to, for really no reason at all, with no medical explanation, suddenly have no idea who they are. They don't know where they're from. They don't know their name. They don't know anything. And it's not like traditional amnesia where it's like a head injury, or even some medications can cause amnesia. You're not getting smacked on the head. You wake up, you have no idea who you are, and there's no medical explanation for it. This is a very rare condition. There's some explanation that it might be related to trauma, but we don't really have a lot of research in this, and we don't really have a lot of explanation. Dissociative fugue is related in a way where it's kind of an amnesic type event where a person just gets up and leaves. So they might be in Virginia, and then 2 days later, they sort of wake up in Hawaii, and they have no idea how they got there. They don't remember traveling. They had no reason to travel. And this is a fugue. It's like a fog. And they don't know why they suddenly up and went somewhere. This is kind of like that traditional soap opera situation where you see a person and then suddenly they're in a different country and they have amnesia and they don't know who they are, but it turns out they have like a whole family and a whole background, and they've just kind of gotten up and left and wound up in some other country or some other city, and then they kind of wake up and they're like, oh my God, who am I? Oh, I know who I am. How did I get here? And so it sounds very fairy tale like, but it is an actual condition that can happen. And again, some explanation is potential trauma, but we still don't really have a really good understanding of what causes this. There doesn't seem to be any sort of medical explanation. It's not like they have a brain tumor or they smack their head. It's just something that kind of happens. Now, so that's amnesia, dissociative amnesia, and dissociative fugue. Again, you're dissociating with your reality. In terms of amnesia, you dissociate in a way that affects your memory, it affects your identity. You don't know, really, you have an issue with your awareness. But fugue, you really don't know where you're at. It's just really a fog that disrupts your whole being. Now, when it comes to dissociative identity disorder, like I said, this one might be one that you actually recognize. So this is also called multiple personality disorder. Now, a lot of people get this confused with schizophrenia, and it actually is not schizophrenia, and schizophrenia is not multiple personality disorder. So, dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder is a condition in which you actually have multiple identities or personalities within yourself. Okay. And so these personalities can have different ages, they can have different genders, they can be completely different people. Some of the identities know about each other and some of them don't. You can actually see a person with dissociative identity disorder, when they change personalities, when one sort of comes out, they change their body language, their voice sounds different. It's like a different person's taking them over. And so this is a really intriguing disorder, and for interestingly, some healthcare professionals actually think it doesn't exist. Some people think that you're actually acting because there's no blood test or test to say, you have multiple personality disorder. It's really observation. Who are the identities? You can have, as few as 2 identities or as many as 40 or more. You can have multiple identities within that. Now, the reason why some healthcare professionals say that it's not a genuine disorder is because for a while, nobody knew about it, right? And the reason why I think it is a legitimate disorder is because there were cases, we did have information about it and symptoms, but it wasn't until the 1970s that the diagnoses kind of blew up and more people came to have multiple personality disorder. Now, one can argue that, well, we just knew more about it, so we knew how to diagnose it. But really what probably happened was starting in the 1970s, people started making movies about it, writing books about it. It became this thing in the media. And so more people learned about it and were educated on it. And so the idea is that people are just acting like they have multiple personalities. And since there's no real test, there's no way to know. It could be that there are a large portion of people who really do have dissociative identity disorder that don't really have it and they're faking it. And they would have to be really good actors, but I'm sure that there are definitely cases out there of people who don't legitimately, genuinely have the disorder. But like I said before, I do think that there are real cases of genuine dissociative identity disorder. And an explanation is that it could be just an extreme form of coping. And the idea is that if you go through some extreme trauma, especially at a young age, you're going to, and it could be a physical trauma, it could be a sexual trauma, emotional trauma, whatever it might be. Especially as a child, the child will dissociate from their identity that experiences the abuse because it's just so painful to live it. And it's so painful to be in that moment, be in that identity. And so it's really difficult to know for sure if somebody actually has it because, like I said, there's no test for it. And we do find that with trauma, a lot of times sort of the opposite effect happens, where they don't necessarily dissociate, but they become sort of more into reality. But I do think that there are legitimate cases where we see this actually happening due to coping with trauma. So it's a really interesting disorder. You're going to see a lot of movies portrayed incorrectly because a lot of myths are that people with dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder have schizophrenia. And it actually is it's a completely different disorder. And so I like to think of dissociative identity disorder as a break from reality, but you have multiple personalities. With schizophrenia,